This year, we're pleased to have formed a relationship with Politico to bring you this special program during lunch. Politico reporter Mike Allen, as well as Jim Vandehei, executive editor and Politico co-founder, are going to be leading a reporter roundtable on today's key cybersecurity issues. Now, we had hoped to have Representative Chairman McCall to join us, but unfortunately, he isn't able to make it. But I do think we'll have a very dynamic discussion, and I would like to turn it over to Politico editor Marty Cady to kick it off.
Thanks, Ellen. Good afternoon. I'm Marty Cady. I'm the managing editor for policy at Politico Pro. Thanks, Ellen, for welcoming us, and thank you, Visa, for making this luncheon possible. We're looking forward to a timely and engaging conversation. Thanks, as always, to everyone joining us here on the live stream. As Ellen said, Chairman McCall was not able to participate today. But on the stage today, we do have a great group of politicos who are going to give us all the latest insights into what's happening in Washington, not only on cyber, but also on the shutdown. Today we'll have Mike Allen, Chief White House Correspondent, Lois Romano, the editor of Politico Events, Tony Romm, a Senior Pro-Technology Reporter, Juana Summers, a Pro-Defense Reporter, and Jim Vandehei, our Executive Editor. Finally, don't forget to join the conversation and tweet your questions to hashtag payment security. We'll have someone up here tracking this on Twitter on a tablet or an iPad. And without any more delay, we're going to bring the panel on up. Thanks.
I think you go first.
You're well. Good afternoon. Welcome to Visa's Cybersecurity Lunch and Cybersecurity Month, which in Washington is about one of the only encouraging things that's happening. We're excited to be here with Ellen Rishley and her team, who've been great partners with Politico over the years. Visa is a technology company that has been a nonpartisan leader in this area. We appreciate those of you who are in the room and also those of you on live stream. We're going to be taking questions with the hashtag payment security. Lois Romano has the iPad here, and we'll take the questions. I'm Mike Allen, and happy to have you here. I'm going to start off by asking a question of my boss, Jim Vandehei, the executive editor, founder of Politico. Will this shutdown last for days or weeks?
I really do have to pull out my BlackBerry for this because we just filed a story, and this will tell you everything you need to know about the state of play. The president's invited congressional leaders tonight to talk about a potential compromise. And in the statement, he says that he's going to call on the House to pass a clean CR to open the government. 2 minutes later, Boehner spokesman puts out a statement saying, well, we've accepted the invitation. Well, why have we accepted? Because we're pleased that the president has finally recognized that his refusal to negotiate is indefensible. Why else would he have this meeting if we're not going to negotiate?
Very diplomatic.
Which tells you the meeting is meaningless. I think this is going to go on, I think, for some time, largely because unlike most of these showdowns, there's not a middle ground. There's no middle ground, and neither side has any incentive, at least at this point, to compromise. The president has drawn a line saying there's no way I'm negotiating over the debt limit or over the CR on my health care bill. And House Republicans have said there's no way that we're giving you the CR bill or the debt limit increase unless you negotiate on the health care bill. So I don't know what a middle ground looks like on that. So my guess is Mike talked to Steve King before we came up here, a congressman from Iowa, one of the leaders of the Tea Party movement in the House.
Tough to draw him out of his shell.
And he said this could go on for months. And it probably doesn't go on for months, but it could go on for a heck of a long time.
Now, Lois Romano, put aside the politics of it, especially here in Washington, there's a real human dimension to it, and you told me you have friends who aren't being paid.
Well, as we all know, this is a company town, and we have a lot of federal employees here. And so I do have friends. I have a father of 3 who this is his second day without getting paid. I have single friends. And so the question is, who is out there to say what is essential personnel? Now, Congress has decided they are essential personnel, but by the end of this week, I can imagine taking a poll, and not many people in the country would think that they were essential personnel.
And Lois, this meeting at 5:30 at the White House, I was just talking to our colleague Jonathan Allen before I came here, and he said that another reason that you know, as Jim said, that it's a bit of a photo op or dog and pony show, is that actual negotiations don't take place around a table with a pool spray. They take place behind closed doors.
That's absolutely true. And I think what this meeting tells you is that the Democrats and the president are controlling all the optics here. They see that everything is going their way. Republicans' approval ratings are going way down. So here's Daddy calling the recalcitrant kids home to tell them, what's going on and how, we're going to try to do what he wants to do. And so, again, it's him projecting to the country. And as far as behind-the-scene negotiations, I hear there are none, that it's kind of silent.
And the idea, and one thing to add to that, this idea, if you watch everyone else talk about this, like, well, eventually there'll be so much pressure on Republicans that, of course, they're going to see the political pressure and they're going to ultimately compromise. I don't know who these people are talking to, because if you talk to House Republicans, they're saying our phones are being lit up with phone calls saying, go get them, go take it to the president. They're not feeling any pressure at home to compromise. And this idea, well, like some of the moderate, the folks in swing districts, like I could count the number of moderates in swing districts in the Republican Party on one hand. That's not enough to get a deal. That's not enough to change things. In '96, there were 40 or 50 Republicans who would have described themselves as moderate. So there was pressure to be applied. They don't exist. They all lost election in the last decade. And so there's not an obvious group of people that's going to go to leadership and say, hey, we got to cut a deal because the politics are bad. They don't care if the politics are bad.
Now, Juana Summers, who covers the Pentagon and writes Morning Defense for Politico very early each morning, you told me that the mood in the Pentagon is dismal. Why?
If you're a Pentagon civilian worker, if you're a contractor, if you work in the building, you've not only been hit by this government shutdown, you've also been hit by the sequester cuts, have already faced furlough. So it is a big deal for the people who work at the Pentagon. And going back to Lois's comment on who's essential and who's not, you saw this troop pay bill that got passed in the late hours Monday night, right before the government was finally heading towards the shutdown. It gives Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel a little bit of flexibility to determine who's essential and who's not when it comes to civilians and contractors. So one of the big things we're going to be watching over the next couple of days is just how far he takes that flexibility. You saw, as we reported yesterday, Buck McKeon, who chairs the House Armed Services Committee, said he thinks this gives the Defense Secretary broad latitude, that he should be able to bring back as many people as he possibly can. 400,000 people facing furloughs is certainly no laughing matter.
And you want to talk about optics, the Pentagon chief has a pretty strong hand, right? If he can say that national security is involved, that's tough to push back against.
He absolutely does, and you heard him say this. He's traveling overseas, and when he spoke to reporters in South Korea, he made the case that this is absolutely embarrassing. This is getting to be terrible. You have this many people, it's unacceptable. This many people who are integral to national security and defense are staying home instead of going to work and being involved in these incredibly important operations.
Now, Tony, one of the biggest problems for Congress is bandwidth. They have a very difficult time chewing gum at the same time. And one of the consequences of these fiscal fights is other issues get pushed aside. No question that cybersecurity is one of the most important issues facing the country, both the Congress and the White House. It's something that has to be dealt with, and yet
cybersecurity is poised to take a big hit. You know, cyber may not rise to the level of the panda cam when it comes to generating headlines about the shutdown, but it's really in a position right now where a lot of the work on major priorities of both the president and Congress can't get done. The big one, obviously, is the president's executive order signed back in February to try to improve the digital defenses of power plants and water systems and other forms of critical infrastructure. You know, in fulfilling that EO, there's a big deadline coming up in the middle of October. That's October 12th. You know, it's not the debt ceiling deadline, but it's a huge deadline for cybersecurity folks, because it would give us an opportunity to see for the first time what this framework might look like. But if you listen to Michael Daniel, the top cybersecurity advisor from the White House, he's come out and said, frankly, if we're on vacation, this isn't going to get done.
And Tony, what's the most controversial element of that executive order? What's your lead probably going to be when and if you see it?
Well, right now, industry is really looking to see exactly what the White House and industry working together can come up with. Because it's only if this framework has sufficient industry input and you can incentivize these folks to participate that really power plants and water systems are going to do it. But all of this requires Congress and the same sorts of folks who are furloughed right now to get the job done.
And what are the external signs, the tea leaves so far about the work between industry and the White House?
The tea leaves actually look kind of good for the framework. Folks are generally pleased with their interactions with NIST and the other agencies. But at the end of the day, it comes down to how do you incentivize companies to do what you're asking them to do voluntarily, and all of those things have to go through Congress. And as we've seen right now from the fights over both the budget and the shutdown and the debt limit, Congress does not have the appetite for anything else.
Now, Jim Vandehei, this morning, the president announced that, the White House announced that 2 of the stops on his 4 stops in Southeast Asia are going to be cut. The president leaves Saturday. It was a 7-day trip. He was going to do first summits in Indonesia and Brunei. Those are still on at the moment. Philippines and Malaysia, which were stops. Afterwards, more tourist stops, relationship stops. They've gotten the axe. Do you think the president winds up cutting off the summits at the beginning too? What will be the issues for him in deciding whether or not he can be out of the country?
You know, I think he'll be under pressure to stay here and at least be seen as being part of the negotiations. Like, part of the problem for the president and part of the problem for Congress is this situation is not built up in isolation. This is the culmination of 10 years of dysfunction. And I would say in each year it gets worse. Like, almost every incentive in modern politics today is working against leadership and is working against a functioning government. If you think about the explosion of new media, if you think about the explosion of outside groups who've gotten so sophisticated at interfering in primary races, if you look at redistricting in the vast majority of our states, if you look at the rise of political celebrities, they're not the deal makers in the middle, they're the nut jobs on both sides. And like that's what gets attention in the culture today. And so this moment, it only could have been fixed or avoided had several things been done previously. The fact that the president, no one thinks that this meeting will bear anything tonight, well, why is that? We sat down with John Boehner, Mike and I, about a month and a half ago and asked him, when's the last time you had a substantive conversation with the President of the United States? He said, not in this calendar year. That he had not had a single substantive conversation with the President. This is the Speaker of the House and the President of the United States.
And it's both of their faults.
Both of their faults.
He said it was Obama's job, and clearly the President needs to be reaching out the other way.
And they should pour booze for this part. It's going to get worse. It's not going to get better.
In case Tony's wasn't sunny enough for you.
Like, every trend that we're talking about up here, it gets worse. Do you think Republicans are going to suddenly become more reasonable heading into the midterm elections, where the base matters most, where a lot of these people are more worried about primary challenges than general election challenges? Do you think the president is suddenly going to become more hospitable to Republican ideas and undoing the centerpiece of his domestic agenda in term 1, healthcare reform? No, it's going to get worse. I think both sides are going to have more incentive to jam up gridlock, to make it hard to get anything done, to make it hard to have substantive conversations to get at anything.
Lois, Romano, the White House believes strongly that they hold all the cards here. They almost are happy for Republicans to be out in front of the microphones because they think the politics of it are so wretched for them. Are they right?
Yes, I think they're totally right, and you could see it very late last night when the Republicans started panicking and saying, okay, let's do a little mini bill where we'll open up a park, and we'll do this and we'll do that, and the White House smartly said no.
They started listing things that they weren't doing.
Right. So they clearly realize that the optics are very bad. Also, I think that analysts will tell you they're overplaying the Obamacare card also. The numbers against Obamacare haven't moved in 3 years. They're about 50 to 53%. They stay the same. But if you
Which is not good for the White House either.
No, it's not good for the White House. But if you break down those numbers, most of those people do not want it repealed. They want it fixed. There are things in it they don't like. They don't want a wholesale repealing of it. And I think the White House obviously has access to the same things we see, and they know that. So they feel like they're on very steady ground right now.
Now, Tony, to what degree has the White House been signaling that cybersecurity is a priority? Is there more that they could have done, or how does industry or people who really track this feel about how much love it gets from them?
The White House has been very out in front of the issue on cybersecurity. That's evident by the fact that Obama has talked about it even in the State of the Union address. That's a very new sort of recent
And is that
development.
partly defensive in case something happens?
It's a little bit of both. I think there's a recognition on Capitol Hill, and members of Congress will tell you this, that Washington doesn't want to be caught off guard, especially when there are all of these signs that the attacks and the threats are just worsening. But at the end of the day, we're not in that different of a place today than we were a year ago. I mean, Jim was talking talking about how much worse this is only going to get when you think about the partisanship on Capitol Hill throughout the Beltway. That's been observed just in the fight over cybersecurity. We still don't have bills. We still are having fights over the fundamentals of government. We're still going back and forth, even though folks are talking about the threats posed by international spies. So, cybersecurity very much caught in the mix.
Now, Juana Summers, you were talking about how the Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel is overseas at the moment. What do we know so far about his style? I think all that a lot of people know about him is that he was the one wearing the orange shirt in the photo that they put out from the Situation Room. I don't think he'll wear that shirt again for a Situation Room photo. But how is his style different from his predecessor Secretary Gates?
Well, the Secretary's personal style aside, I think one of the things that I've noticed is when I'm talking to Republicans on the Hill who are absolutely against this nomination, were willing to go as far as they could to block it, they've actually—
And there were a lot more of those than anybody expected. The White House was surprised by how much trouble this was.
Absolutely.
Because he was nominally a Republican, so they thought they would get love for that.
Absolutely, but he absolutely didn't get any love on Capitol Hill, but now, months later, people have actually said that they respect. I remember talking to several lawmakers, including Randy Forbes of Virginia, obviously a very strong Republican, saying, he's actually doing a couple things right. So he's gotten very good reviews on the Hill so far. Obviously, with the continuing situation in Syria, a couple more conflicts coming up, the department's still figuring out how to grapple with sequestration, whether or not it will have to contend with more budget cuts. That reaction could change, but there's certainly been a certain deal of approval for him by people you wouldn't expect.
Now, Jim Vandehei, back when you worked for a living, you used to cover the House leadership when you were a congressional reporter. Do a little Kremlinology for us on this House leadership.
It's just so much different. I mean, I covered Congress largely in the 90s and early 2000s. And back then, leadership actually had power, had real power, and had tools of power. If you were Tom DeLay or you're Newt Gingrich, you had earmarks back then, which is I get to give you money if you listen to me, which is a great thing to have if you're a leader. You also had the threat. You would say, if you don't listen to me, I'm going to kick you off a committee. Or if you do vote the way I want you to, I'm going to put you on a better committee. Now you have no earmarks, and now most rank and filers would say, good, kick me off a committee. I don't like your committees anyways. And you say you won't support me in my reelection. I don't care. You're toxic. My rank and file members, they don't like leadership. They think you're sellouts. And so you have just a weak leadership, which you never used to have. And I think that, to me, is the defining characteristic of this moment in politics, that you have, at almost every level, you have pretty weak leaders. You essentially, if you think of the president and like the span of his presidency, he's probably at his weakest state right now. If you think of John Boehner, I can't think of a weaker speaker that we've had, certainly in my lifetime. If you think of Mitch McConnell, who could be strong because he's pretty savvy tactically, he's pretty weak because he's so worried about his own reelection in 2014 that he's essentially sidelined himself. And then Harry Reid, who I think gives this personification of power and is in the headlines a lot, he's weakened because of the filibuster rules, and he's got his own group of members who are running for re-election in red states. So none of these leaders have the power to actually impose things on their members like you used to. So it's just a lot different. I can't emphasize how little power John Boehner has over these House Republicans. When people just say, well, Boehner, stand up. Boehner would say, do that, his shrug thing. Well, what do you want me to do? There's nothing he can do. He can't force them to vote a certain way.
Lois, one of the biggest issues on the agenda of the financial services community is tax reform. And one of the things I'm told, based on the bandwidth comment that I heard from that Tony was making, is that this pushes back tax reform. That the one possibility that our congressional reporters tell us that there is that it's part of some big super deal on both spending and the debt ceiling, that you could maybe put a process in place for tax reform. But the funny thing is, you talk to a lot of financial services companies, they're fine with that because they do well under the current status quo. What are the optics of tax reform? And can you imagine real progress on that issue?
No.
You get the award for the briefest, the most to-the-point answer.
I think it's a hot potato. And I think, first of all, this pushes everything back. So Congress is going to have to, and if everybody here is correct, it's going to last a couple of weeks. And so it's going to take us right into the debt ceiling, which is going to be another dog and pony show for another 2 weeks. So we're going to lose a month of legislative abilities. So I think tax reform, if you recall the last time there was a tax issue, Speaker Boehner had to vote with Democrats or get Democrats to vote with him. He doesn't seem inclined to do that right now. So I don't see that there's going to be any.
Understatement, yeah.
I don't see that there's going to be any mind meld to get to a tax reform place before the end of the year.
I'm going to bring you all into the conversation in just a minute, so get ready for a question. But first, I'm going to ask Tony something about the commercial opportunities in cyberspace. We had a CEO of a defense company come into Politico the other day, talked to our Politico Pro reporters, and we asked, in an age of drawdown, in an age of sequester, how does a defense company grow? And the answer was cybersecurity.
It's absolutely true. And you're starting to see members of Congress, state regulators, those sorts of folks recognize this possibility because they see jobs. It all kind of links together. I mean, you just take a trip to Maryland these days, you know, they call it the cyber corridor. You drive down the highway, you see all these cybersecurity startups, all of these longtime defense contractors that are setting up space there because they recognize that's a huge future new revenue stream. And it's one that members of Congress want to fund. They're approving huge billion-dollar increases in these funds to defend networks and in some cases to go after the bad guys, and the president's behind it too. Lots of money to be made in that space.
Okay, if somebody wants to rebut, argue, debate, the floor is yours. Does somebody have a question? While you're thinking of it, yes, sir. And just say who you are if you don't mind. Yeah, that's all right. We can hear you. We'll repeat it. We'll repeat the question.
Oh, there we go.
My name is Arthur Katz. I worked in the government for almost 40 years in the science area and a variety of areas. What I see is really the undermining of the long-term infrastructure of the U.S. government's science capabilities, both at its national laboratories. I was in the Department of Energy, but overall, and from NIH. And you know, science is what drives this economy in the long term. And you're talking about maybe something showing up in 5 to 10 years, not next year, and that's the problem. You won't see it. But you're starting to see the U.S. lose people. I mean, when I was growing up, and for years, people came from India and China and all they stay here, or at least a large number. Now they're going back. They don't see a future here, and a lot of people are going to places like Singapore where it's just heavily funded. So the question is something going to change? Otherwise, we're going to be in a serious trouble, not next year, but 5 years from now.
Okay, jump ball. Who wants to grab that?
Sure.
Tony?
I mean, it's especially pronounced when you think about sequestration here. I mean, one of the big criticisms there was that the science community, the research community that depends pretty greatly on government dollars was going to take a pretty significant hit. And you're seeing it again with the shutdown. I mean, even just on an anecdotal level, friends who do research can't get into labs, can't access their data. It's having this very wide effect on folks who do this sort of thing for a living. Now, the White House has proposed increases in places like ARPA-E and at the NIH, much less than what the community would look for. But as we start to tighten, pocketbooks around here, the propensity for more increases is starting to slim down. You heard that right after the president's State of the Union address, when members of Congress weren't exactly jumping to give the billion-dollar increases some were looking for.
If you have a question, signal Sophie. She'll come over to you. But while you're, I think we have one. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Start.
Eyes in the back of my head. So given your layout of the current dilemma in the Congress and the fact that there's no incentive for Republican House members to take action, do we have to wait until Hillary Clinton is elected president and
this is what we call a
Boehner
loaded
is
question.
thrown out of office because the Democrats are now a majority in both the House and the Senate? Is that the scenario? That it seems from your explanation, that's the only counterforce that will push the Republican House members one way or the other.
I think, putting aside whether it's Hillary Clinton or not, what you hit on is think about the last decade in politics. Like, there's so much volatility. We live in a 50-50 country, so you have massive change. Every election now is almost every election for the last 5 has been some form of a change election. And the only 2 pockets of government action you saw were when it was President Bush with an all-Republican Congress, or President Obama during the first 2 years with an all-Democratic Congress. Then you get massive change. I think, at least for the foreseeable future, that is the only time you're going to see massive change, or maybe even any change in governing absent crises. I just don't think the system is built right now, and there's nothing on the horizon that says suddenly Republicans are going to want to compromise with Democrats or vice versa. I can't stress enough that this can be empirically proven. If you just look at the House and the number of members that would say they're a moderate in either party is at a historic low. It's not just Republicans that have this problem. You used to have 50 blue dog Democrats, conservative Democrats who could often be more conservative than a moderate Republican. There's only 13 or 14 of them left. So you just have a very liberal, very Democratic caucus, a very conservative Republican caucus. So the only time you're really going to get big change is when you have all-party rule. But the problem with that is, and what you're seeing with healthcare is that when you have these swings, then the next, once there's divided government, all of the action is towards undoing what someone else just did, which is a very unsatisfying thing if you're a spectator of government, or if you're someone relying on, you talked about science, like is there going to be a resurgence in the infrastructure of science? Like, no, it's going to continue to be a fight over less. There's not going to suddenly be a resurgence with Republicans part of the equation wanting to invest more, and that Republicans want to shrink the size of government. And so the only time that you're either going to have that shrinkage or that massive expansion is going to be through one-party rule.
So we appreciate those of you in live stream land who don't get the whoopie pies that we have on our tables here. Keep tweeting us questions at #PaymentSecurity. Lois, Romano, I think you have a Twitter question.
We do, from David Morrison on Twitter, and he says, will the default hike put pressure on the Republicans? Mikey?
Absolutely. And this is the ultimate backstop. So October 17th is the deadline for raising the tax ceiling, raising the debt ceiling. And we talked to Republicans privately, and they recognize that it's unthinkable to default. Now, we had one exception to that. We interviewed Congressman Stephen King today. He said, oh, it's not really that bad. I can tell you there's very few people who know much about markets who agree with that. Jim, can you imagine either side defaulting?
Yes. I could. I think there's a lot of Republicans who'd be willing to default to make their point over health care. And they've said it. It's not me saying it. You talk to Steve King, he'd default in a heartbeat if that's what it took to get a change on Obamacare. And what is so confounding to me, if you just think about the Republican strategy, what was it? Was it Martin Sheen, or who was it? Charlie Sheen, who was all doped up and he said, winning, duh. Like, they were winning the health care debate. They were. If you look at the polls that Lois was talking about, most people did not have a favorable impression of healthcare. So if Republicans had just played this out and not shut down the government, there's no way that there wouldn't be even more attention paid over the last 48 hours about the glitches in the ramp out, and they probably would have had a better chance to make their case long term and change it through the normal legislative process.
But this is what I don't get. Going back to July, we wrote about and talked to people about polling that showed that the only way that you could make Obamacare a positive for the president and negative for Republicans was to shut down the government. This was July when the trio of senators first started talking about it. So how is it that 3 months later they're doing it?
Because most of these members are children of the healthcare revolution. We talked about this yesterday. Most of these Tea Party members, even Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, all of them, they never lived in Washington pre-Obamacare. They were elected because of the debate over Obamacare. They came specifically to undo Obamacare. To them, Obamacare is everything they hate about government. So for them, this isn't a minor side issue. It is the issue. It is the central obsession of their own ideology and for a lot of their constituents. They don't like the law. They think it symbolizes the intrusive growth of a dysfunctional government. And so they feel like we're not just making a minor stand, they think we're making a heroic stand, and they're willing to take bigger risks than their leaders would, including the potential of default, to make their point, because they know there aren't that many trigger points where they might get the other side to blink. Default, the market's tanked by 1,000 points. They might say, whatever, now will you blink? And that's what's scary. I don't think we'll default, but I'd say there's a 30% chance that we hit that. And I might be, you can tell I'm a pretty pessimistic guy these days, so I might be more pessimistic than the average person, but I don't think that that's an unreasonable percentage.
Juana Summers, were you going to jump in?
I was talking to a House Republican member on the House Financial Services Committee, and he made the argument to me that when you're looking at this issue, it is absurd to him that the president and Democrats in both the House and Senate would be willing to put the full faith and credit of the United States government on the line. He made the case that this is just showing how attached to this idea of Obamacare, this law that the president is, that he's unwilling to waiver it all and to go as far as to damage our credit. So I think that really speaks to Jim's point. I would also agree with that contention. There's probably a 30% chance that we actually end up going there. And a lot of Republicans now who weren't coming out of the woodwork before are saying so publicly that, yeah, they're willing to push it that far.
And you have to look at it not through your eyes. You have to look at it through the eyes of a member who's in a redistricted district that's drawn to have a ton of very conservative voters. And this came up during gun control, and everyone watching, there's going to be gun control because of these shootings. And we were like, no, there's not going to be any gun control. Because if you just talk to these House members and ask them, how many phone calls have you gotten for gun control? They would say 0. How many have you gotten against it? 1,000. Well, who are they going to respond to? The 1,000. And people assume and think about politics through their own mind as opposed to through the mind of the people who actually have to do the voting, and their minds are often different than our minds or everyone in this room's minds.
And Jim Vandehei, we saw the same phenomenon with immigration.
With them, yes, each and every issue that people have thought is finally going to get done, and they assume conservatives would acquiesce, they have not. And what part of that pattern are people not catching on to? That they have to look at what these conservatives are thinking and hearing back home, and they're not hearing, let's do gun control. They're not hearing, let's do immigration reform. They're not hearing, let's not shut down the government. They're hearing the opposite. There's someone over there with a question.
Go ahead.
The other day that from his point of view as a president, he can't compromise, because if he does, then this tactic, the tactic of saying do it our way, or we shut down the government, or we don't allow the debt ceiling to be extended, or we push the plunge on some other calamitous occasion, becomes the norm for politics in the United States at the national level, because future Congresses will do the same thing to future presidents. So he does not want to be the president that lets this tactic become the norm in the United States.
I agree with you absolutely. And you talk to people in the White House, and they will tell you that rebalancing the powers between Congress and the White House is one of the big reasons that they say that they're not going to negotiate over the debt ceiling. You know, one of the most surprising things in politics is when people actually do what they're going to say. Do what they say they're going to do. And I keep asking Republicans, what if the president is right that he won't negotiate over the debt ceiling? Juana Summers, if they stick to that, Republicans are in a jam.
They absolutely are in a jam, because then there becomes this question. You've already seen the DCCC put out the GOPshutdown.com website. This is turning into campaign season, and this will be huge leverage for Democrats and campaigns. So it does put them in quite a jam and takes an issue that could have been a huge boon for them, as polls show, as Lois suggested, and completely flips it on its head, makes the problem in 2014 and heading on to 2016 in presidential races.
And let me just add, on the signing up for health care yesterday, even those optics worked for the White House in the sense that, yes, you know, all the computers crashed, but the way they're spinning that is that so many people, you know, signed up, and the need was so overwhelming that, see, the Republicans are wrong.
Okay, your Twitter is beeping.
Can I add one quick point that goes right to what the questioner was asking? I think that is true. I think he would forever weaken the presidency if he acquiesced to it. And you have to look at it the other way around. Imagine if Mitt Romney were president and you had a Democratic Congress, and Democrats said, listen, we think that there's income disparity in the country, and unless you impose a 50% surtax on everybody in the upper 2 percentile to even out the income disparity, then we're going to shut down the government. How would Republicans respond to that? Because that is the same thing. It goes to the core of an ideological fight that goes to the core of something that is already stated law. And if you start to use the funding of the government as a mechanism to jam through your agenda, that you would take the presidency and severely weaken it. So I think that his principle is one that they are fighting for. And I'm sure Dick Cheney, if he were in the room, would say, yes, like I would advise you to do the same thing. You can never have a weak presidency.
Good question.
All right, we have one more question, and then I think that's it. And it's from Sean. Is the shutdown going to affect the interplay between the government and banks, which are usually flagged to breaches by the FBI? Who would like to?
Well, those sort of essential services should continue working. Remember, there are essential personnel who are monitoring for these sorts of threats. But, you know, at the same time, you have folks like those from the National Security Agency who are up on the Hill today saying that the shutdown has very seriously hurt their ability to kind of monitor for stuff, which is in and of itself a piece of news away from this conversation. But the big takeaway here for cybersecurity is that for as long as we continue to have these debates over shutdowns or whatever noun it happens to be, for as long as it continues to be campaign season, as Juana put it, none of the things that have to happen for cybersecurity will get done. None of the legislation that's been called for industry, none of the privacy protections that some of the civil liberties groups really want, none of the priorities that President Obama has talked about quite extensively in speeches across the country will get done. And the prognosis for the rest of the year is, and I'm pretty pessimistic too, Jim, is probably even below 30% that we start to see the legislation that even a year ago we thought might be possible.
And we're about to get the hook here, but I'm going to cheat and ask Juana Summers one more question. And that is, we have a question here, so go ahead, quick, sir. This will be a rapid round. Just speak from where you are.
What kind of pain will be inflicted on all these Republican districts, on the individual constituents in these Republican districts that will get them to change their minds? Obviously, something has to happen there.
I think most of their, well, that's a very good question, and we don't know that. But most of the Republicans that are driving this are from districts that are supporting them. They're very, very conservative districts. But we'd have to see what happens in a month when a lot of these people in some of the districts that maybe have high government employees, have bases, and they start to lose their income.
Remember, you can deal with a government shutdown for a while. There's ways to pay. The essential employees can get paid. It might be uncomfortable for a lot of people, including some in this room, but you can live with it. The trigger might be if you do default, like once all of a sudden the market's down 1,000 points and suddenly Wall Street really hasn't reacted so far because they've already factored into their own market calculation mass dysfunction out of Washington. So dysfunction to them is just like, whatever, we had that one calculated in. What they don't have calculated in is what happened if we default on debt and suddenly now you're talking about huge problems across the economy that could have effect on people investing in business, people hiring, people's own portfolios because their worth goes down because they have so much stuck in 401ks. That might be the type of pain. I don't think the government shutdown pain, I think they could last months before it becomes so severe that there's an uprising in a conservative district that would force a recalibration of their strategy.
And a last question now for Juana Summers. What's something that we'll be reading tomorrow in Morning Defense or on Politico Pro? As Chris Matthews would say, tell me something I don't know.
So in about an hour in House Armed Services Committee, people from the administration will be coming in to talk about sequestration. And the question is, will it get worse before it gets better? And I assume the answer to that is absolutely yes. You have these, as I spoke about earlier, you have these two compounded threats, both of sequestration, now a government shutdown. I don't think things will be looking any better for those of you guys out there in Arlington anytime soon.
So it's all been downhill.
On that upbeat note.
Hope you enjoyed your lunch.
Yeah, ever since I said Happy Cybersecurity Month, it's all been downhill from there. But thank those of you in live stream land for joining us. We're grateful to the people in the room. Thank Visa for making this possible. We're happy to be part of the Global Security Summit. We appreciate the panelists here, and we have a logistical note for you. The program will continue in the amphitheater at 1:30. In the meantime, we invite you to visit the sponsor kiosk directly outside the amphitheater in the foyer. Happy Cybersecurity Month, and thank you for being here.